Sometimes, the smallest question changes the biggest life, but only if someone is willing to hear it. The rain had finally stopped over Midtown Manhattan, leaving the sidewalks shimmering beneath thousands of golden reflections from luxury storefronts and towering glass buildings. Office workers hurried home with paper coffee cups in their hands. Yellow taxis splashed through shallow puddles, and the city continued moving with its usual confidence, never slowing down long enough to notice the people left behind. Naomi Carter stood beneath the faded awning of a closed bookstore, pulling her thin denim jacket tighter around herself as the cold October wind slipped through every worn thread. She hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The last 24 hours had become a blur of job applications, unanswered emails, and polite smiles that hid the growing emptiness twisting inside her stomach. Every dollar she had earned that week had already disappeared into hospital bills for her younger brother, Isaiah, whose congenital heart condition demanded medications far more expensive than anyone working 2 hourly jobs could realistically afford. She had skipped breakfast, then lunch, then dinner, not because she wanted to, because someone she loved needed another day. Across the street, the warm glow of a quiet cafe spilled onto the sidewalk like an invitation meant for everyone except her. The smell of grilled beef, toasted bread, and melted cheese drifted through the crisp evening air, making her close her eyes for just a moment. Hunger had a strange way of awakening memories. Sunday cookouts with her late grandmother in Atlanta. Homemade sweet potato pie cooling beside an open window. Laughter that once made an empty house feel rich. Those memories were dangerous now because they reminded her of everything she refused to lose. Her dignity, her hope, and the promise she had whispered beside her mother's hospital bed years ago that no matter how difficult life became, she would never stop moving forward. Inside the cafe, Ethan Whitmore barely noticed the untouched half of his gourmet burger resting beside a basket of seasoned fries. At 38, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Capital had mastered the art of winning negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars while somehow forgetting what his own meals tasted like. Another meeting had ended. Another acquisition had closed. Another congratulatory message flashed across his phone. Yet the expensive watch on his wrist could not measure the growing silence that had settled into his life. He stared absently through the rain-speckled window, seeing only reflections until one figure caught his attention. A young black woman stood outside with tired eyes but remarkably steady posture. She wasn't staring at customers. She wasn't asking strangers for spare change. She simply stood there, gathering courage that seemed heavier than the storm clouds drifting away above Manhattan. Ethan watched as she took one careful step toward the entrance before stopping again. Her fingers tightened around the strap of an old canvas backpack. She almost turned around. Almost. Then she quietly walked inside. The conversations around the cafe continued uninterrupted until she reached his table. Her voice was soft enough that only he could hear it, yet every word carried the weight of someone protecting the last piece of pride she still possessed. "I'm so hungry. Are you still eating that?" For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to pause. Ethan looked down at the untouched half of his meal, then back into the young woman's eyes. There was no manipulation in them, no performance, no expectation, only honesty wrapped in humility. In that single fragile moment, neither of them realized they were no longer looking at a leftover hamburger. They were standing at the doorway of two futures that would never look the same again. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the young woman standing before him with the quiet composure of someone who had already rehearsed the possibility of hearing the word no. Her shoulders remained straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes, and her hands stayed respectfully folded in front of her instead of reaching toward the plate. She was asking for food, not demanding kindness. That distinction struck him harder than any presentation he had heard inside the boardrooms that filled most of his life. Around them, the soft music continued to drift through the cafe, while steaming espresso machines hissed behind the counter. A few customers glanced in their direction before returning to conversations about vacations, stock prices, and weekend plans, never realizing that something extraordinary was unfolding only a few feet away. Ethan slowly pushed the basket aside instead of sliding it toward her. Naomi felt her heartbeat sink. She gave a small nod, already preparing to apologize for interrupting his evening. Before she could speak, Ethan looked up at a nearby server with calm certainty. "Would you please bring us 2 fresh dinners? And make sure they are hot." The server hesitated for only a second before smiling. "Of course, sir." Naomi blinked in surprise. "You do not have to do that," she said quietly. "The leftovers would have been enough." Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her expression instead of her clothes. "Maybe, but everyone deserves a meal that was prepared for them, not one that someone else decided they did not want." The words settled gently between them. Naomi lowered her eyes, fighting the unfamiliar feeling rising in her chest. Gratitude had often arrived tangled with embarrassment throughout her life, but this felt different. There was no pity in his voice, no performance, only quiet respect. She slowly accepted the empty chair across from him after he gestured toward it. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Outside, city lights reflected across the wet pavement like scattered pieces of gold. The silence was comfortable, almost surprising for 2 strangers whose worlds should never have crossed. When the meals arrived, the aroma of grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, warm mashed potatoes, and freshly baked rolls filled the table. Naomi instinctively waited until Ethan picked up his fork before touching her own plate. Even then, she ate slowly, taking small bites as though trying to make each one last. Ethan noticed. Hungry people usually rushed. She did not. She treated every bite with gratitude instead of desperation. "What is your name?" he finally asked. She swallowed before answering. "Naomi Carter." "I am Ethan." She smiled politely. "I know who you are, Mr. Whitmore. Most people in New York do." He laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. It had been days since anything had felt genuinely amusing. "Then you have the advantage." Naomi shook her head. "Not really. I only know the version that appears in business magazines." Ethan looked down at the untouched glass of sparkling water beside his plate. "Sometimes that version is the one I know least." The conversation drifted naturally after that. Naomi spoke carefully, never mentioning the long nights, the overdue rent, or the medications waiting to be purchased. Instead, she talked about her younger brother's dream of becoming an architect because he loved drawing bridges across rivers he had never seen. She described how every Sunday they walked through Central Park because it was free and because Isaiah believed every tree had its own personality. Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time in years, someone was speaking to him without asking for an investment, a recommendation, or a signature. When the plates were finally empty, Naomi folded her napkin neatly beside them and whispered, "Thank you for treating me like a person instead of a problem." Ethan held her gaze, realizing those simple words carried more weight than every award displayed inside his office. As Naomi stepped back into the cool Manhattan evening, neither of them noticed the receipt still resting on the table. At the bottom, beneath the total, Ethan had quietly written 6 words that he could not fully explain even to himself. "Some meetings are never accidents." Naomi stepped out into the cool evening carrying nothing except the warmth of a full meal and a memory she could not quite explain. The city had not changed while she sat inside the cafe. Horns still echoed between glass towers, subway trains still rumbled beneath the streets, and strangers still hurried past one another without making eye contact. Yet somehow the familiar sidewalks felt lighter beneath her worn sneakers. It was not because one dinner had solved her problems. Tomorrow's rent was still overdue. Isaiah still needed another prescription before the weekend. The stack of unanswered job applications waiting inside her backpack had not magically disappeared. But for the first time in weeks, someone had looked directly at her instead of through her. She reached the aging brick apartment building just after 9 o'clock. The hallway lights flickered as she climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, careful not to wake neighbors whose televisions leaked muffled laughter through thin walls. Apartment 3C greeted her with peeling paint, second-hand furniture, and a small kitchen where every cabinet had been repaired more than once. To Naomi, it was still home because it was the only place where Isaiah smiled without pretending. The 16-year-old looked up from a notebook spread across the kitchen table. his pencil resting beside a page filled with carefully sketched suspension bridges and city skylines. "You are smiling," he observed with a grin. "That usually means something impossible happened." Naomi laughed softly as she placed a small paper bag on the table. Before leaving the cafe, she had quietly wrapped the untouched dinner roll and 2 chocolate chip cookies the server insisted she take. "Dinner happened," she answered. Isaiah's eyes widened. "Real dinner," she nodded. "The kind that comes with warm bread." Neither of them rushed to eat. They split the bread in half, broke each cookie into equal pieces, and talked about ordinary things that made difficult lives feel surprisingly peaceful. Isaiah described a bridge he hoped to design someday, one strong enough to withstand hurricanes along the Atlantic coast. Naomi listened with genuine fascination, asking questions as though she were speaking to the engineer he dreamed of becoming rather than a teenager forced to spend too many afternoons inside hospitals. Miles away, Ethan entered the quiet penthouse overlooking Central Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city sparkling beneath the autumn sky, while carefully selected artwork lined walls that rarely witnessed conversation. His house manager had left a note beside the marble kitchen island reminding him that breakfast meetings began at 7 the next morning. Another note listed charity invitations waiting for his response. He placed both aside without reading them. Instead, he loosened his tie and stood before the window, watching countless lights blink across Manhattan like distant stars. Usually those lights reminded him of opportunity. Tonight they reminded him of one pair of steady brown eyes refusing to surrender their dignity despite impossible circumstances. He found himself wondering whether Naomi had reached home safely, whether she had family waiting for her, whether she had eaten enough. The questions felt unfamiliar. He was accustomed to studying quarterly reports, not strangers. Yet every attempt to return his attention to financial documents ended the same way. His thoughts drifted back to the quiet young woman who had thanked him not for the meal itself, but for treating her like a person. Ethan walked into his private library and stopped before an old photograph resting inside a silver frame. It showed him at 19 beside his late mother, who had volunteered every Saturday at neighborhood food banks long before Whitmore Capital became a household name. She often reminded him that success was measured by the number of people who felt seen after meeting you. He had admired those words as a young man. Somewhere between mergers, headlines, and endless ambition, he had forgotten them. As midnight settled over Manhattan, 2 people looked out separate windows beneath the same sky. One prayed tomorrow would bring another chance to keep her family together. The other quietly realized that despite possessing more wealth than he could spend in a lifetime, the most valuable thing he had received all week was a simple reminder of what kindness looked like when it arrived without applause. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that spilled between Manhattan's skyscrapers, painting the city in soft shades of gold before the rush of another busy day erased the quiet. Naomi woke before dawn, as she always did, carefully folding the thin blanket on the living room sofa where she had slept so Isaiah could have the bedroom before school. The apartment was still except for the gentle hum of an old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning to fill the streets below. She prepared oatmeal using the last cup of rolled oats in the cabinet, placing the larger bowl in front of Isaiah before pouring herself a glass of water. He looked at the table, then back at her with knowing eyes. "You are not hungry?" he asked. Naomi smiled, the same steady smile that had carried her through countless difficult mornings. "I had a wonderful dinner last night. I am still full." Isaiah accepted the answer, although they both knew it was only half true. As he gathered his backpack, he slipped one folded sketch into her hand. It showed a graceful suspension bridge stretching across a wide river beneath a bright sunrise. Along the bottom he had written in careful block letters, "Every bridge begins with one side believing the other side is worth reaching." Naomi folded the paper gently and placed it inside her backpack beside her resumes. Across the city, Ethan arrived at Whitmore Capital headquarters before most of his executive team. The marble lobby reflected the morning light with polished perfection, while employees greeted him respectfully as elevators opened one after another. Normally his schedule moved with mechanical precision, but today his attention wandered. During the weekly leadership meeting, Conversations revolved around expansion plans, investment portfolios, and projected earnings. Graphs illuminated the massive conference room screen, yet Ethan found himself staring through them rather than at them. Finally, his chief operating officer, Daniel Brooks, noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked after the meeting ended. Ethan looked toward the skyline outside his office windows. "Daniel, have you ever met someone for 5 minutes and realized they changed the way you were thinking?" Daniel laughed. "Usually that only happens after my wife reminds me to stop working on Sundays." Ethan smiled faintly but remained thoughtful. Once the office emptied, he pressed the intercom. "Emily, could you come in for a moment?" His executive assistant entered carrying a digital tablet. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Yesterday evening I met someone named Naomi Carter. I would like to know if she has ever applied for a position at any of our companies." Emily nodded professionally without asking unnecessary questions. "I will check our employment records." Less than an hour later, she returned holding a slim folder instead of her tablet. "I found something interesting," she said as she placed it on his desk. "Miss Carter applied twice during the past 18 months. Once for an administrative assistant position. Once for a community outreach coordinator role. Both applications were impressive, but neither advanced to the interview stage because the positions had already been filled internally." Ethan opened the folder. Inside rested a neatly organized resume, volunteer certificates, academic transcripts, and recommendation letters from professors and nonprofit directors. His eyes paused on one detail: Bachelor of Public Administration. Graduated with honors. Outstanding Community Leadership Award. Hundreds of volunteer hours mentoring disadvantaged youth. There was no mention of hardship, no explanation for employment gaps, and no request for sympathy. Every page reflected discipline, humility, and determination. Ethan leaned back slowly. The woman who had quietly asked for a meal possessed qualifications that many applicants proudly displayed on social media, yet she had chosen silence instead of excuses. Curious, he continued reading. One recommendation letter ended with a single handwritten sentence from a former professor. "If character could be measured like intelligence, Naomi Carter would be the standard by which I would judge every future student." Ethan closed the folder carefully, feeling an unexpected sense of admiration. He had spent years studying balance sheets to determine the value of companies. Yet somehow he had overlooked the simple truth that the greatest assets could never be summarized by numbers alone. As the afternoon sun climbed higher above Manhattan, Naomi continued walking from one interview to another carrying hope inside an aging backpack, completely unaware that somewhere only a few miles away, someone had just discovered the extraordinary story hidden behind her quiet smile. By late afternoon, the October sky had turned a soft shade of silver as cool winds swept through the avenues of Manhattan, carrying fallen leaves across polished sidewalks where thousands of strangers passed one another without ever sharing a single story. Naomi had completed her 4th interview of the day, and although each conversation ended with the familiar promise that someone would contact her soon, experience had taught her that those words often disappeared long before the emails ever arrived. Still, she refused to let disappointment shape the way she walked. She adjusted the strap of her weathered backpack, tucked Isaiah's drawing safely inside, and continued toward the subway station. As she approached the busy intersection outside Whitmore Capital's headquarters, traffic slowed unexpectedly. A delivery cyclist had lost control while trying to avoid a taxi, scattering several large presentation boards and dozens of documents across the sidewalk. People glanced over for a brief moment before continuing on with their schedules, unwilling to sacrifice even a minute of their day. Naomi immediately stepped forward. Without hesitation, she knelt on the pavement, carefully gathering the papers before the wind could carry them into the street. She organized each page in numerical order, noticing charts, financial projections, and architectural renderings without reading more than necessary. The cyclist, embarrassed but grateful, repeatedly thanked her as she helped secure everything back onto the cart. Just as she handed over the final folder, the revolving doors of Whitmore Capital opened. Ethan emerged alongside Daniel Brooks and several senior executives. discussing preparations for an important investor presentation scheduled later that evening. Their conversation stopped when Ethan recognized the familiar backpack before he saw Naomi's face. She looked up at the same moment. Surprise crossed both of their expressions, followed by genuine smiles that arrived naturally rather than politely. "Miss Carter," Ethan said warmly, "I did not expect to see you again so soon." Naomi stood, brushing a few leaves from her jacket. "Neither did I, Mr. Whitmore. It is a small city after all." Daniel glanced between them with quiet curiosity, while the cyclist enthusiastically explained how Naomi had saved every document before they could be ruined by traffic or rainwater. Ethan noticed that she had never once asked who the materials belonged to or whether anyone was watching. She simply helped because someone needed help. That mattered. "Were you on your way somewhere?" Ethan asked. Naomi nodded. "Home. My brother will be wondering whether I remembered to buy milk." Ethan smiled. "Would you have 10 minutes instead?" She looked slightly uncertain. "For what?" "For coffee. There is something I would like to ask you." Naomi hesitated just long enough to weigh the invitation against the responsibilities waiting at home. She appreciated kindness, but she had learned never to mistake generosity for obligation. "I cannot stay long," she answered honestly. "My brother comes first." Ethan respected the answer immediately, as he should. They crossed into the building's quiet cafe overlooking the lobby, where evening sunlight poured through towering windows. After ordering 2 coffees and a pair of fresh blueberry muffins, Ethan placed a slim folder on the table. Naomi recognized her own name printed neatly across the front. Her eyes widened in confusion. "You found my application." Ethan nodded. "Actually, I found 2 of them. I also found recommendation letters from people who clearly believe you have something rare." Naomi looked down at the folder but made no attempt to open it. "Those letters are kind," she said softly, "but kindness does not create job openings." Ethan folded his hands calmly. "No, but character creates opportunities, and I think our company may have overlooked someone we should have met a long time ago." Naomi searched his face, trying to understand whether she was hearing hope or simply another polite conversation destined to fade away. Ethan met her gaze with complete sincerity before asking one quiet question that neither of them realized would shape everything that followed. "If I offered you an opportunity to prove yourself instead of promising you anything, would you accept the challenge?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She wrapped both hands around the warm paper coffee cup, allowing the heat to settle into her fingers while she carefully considered the question. Life had taught her that opportunities and promises were rarely the same thing. One disappeared as quickly as it appeared. The other demanded trust that had to be earned. She looked at Ethan with calm honesty. "I will accept any challenge that expects my best work. I will not accept special treatment." Ethan smiled, recognizing the quiet strength behind her words. "That is exactly the answer I hope to hear." He opened the folder and removed a single document. Whitmore Capital is expanding its community development division. The team works with neighborhoods, nonprofit organizations, and small business owners across the city. They need someone who understands people before numbers. "I am not offering you the position today. I am offering you the chance to compete for it." Naomi read the first page carefully. It described a 3-day assessment that included research, planning, presentations, and practical problem solving alongside several other finalists. There were no shortcuts, no guarantees, and no mention of Ethan's involvement beyond approving the program itself. She slowly nodded. "Then if I earn it, nobody can say I did not belong." Ethan leaned back with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly." 2 mornings later, Naomi walked through the revolving doors of Whitmore Capital carrying the same worn backpack she had owned for years. Around her, polished marble floors reflected the bright lobby lights, while employees in tailored business attire moved confidently between elevators and conference rooms. A few glanced toward her simple clothes before returning to their conversations, but Naomi kept her attention on the welcome desk. She had not come to impress anyone with appearances. She had come prepared to let her work speak for itself. Emily greeted her warmly and escorted her to the training floor, where 6 other candidates had already gathered around a large conference table. Most carried expensive leather portfolios and introduced themselves with polished confidence. Naomi simply smiled, shook hands, and took an empty seat near the window. The assessment began with a straightforward assignment. Each participant received the same fictional case involving a struggling neighborhood where local businesses were closing despite generous financial grants. The candidates were asked to recommend solutions within 2 hours. While others immediately focused on budgets, tax incentives, and marketing campaigns, Naomi quietly studied every page before writing a single word. She noticed something hidden inside the community survey attached to the file. Residents repeatedly mentioned transportation difficulties, lack of childcare, and limited evening services. The businesses were not failing because people lacked interest. Families simply could not reach them consistently. When presentation time arrived, candidates proposed larger investments and aggressive advertising. Naomi stood only after everyone else had finished. Her voice remained steady as she spoke. Money is important, but trust is more valuable. If families cannot reach businesses, businesses cannot survive. Before increasing investment, I would create neighborhood shuttle partnerships, evening family events, and shared childcare programs supported by local organizations. When people feel included, they return. When they return, businesses grow naturally. The room became unusually quiet. Several evaluators exchanged thoughtful glances while taking notes. Ethan observed the session from behind the glass wall of an adjoining conference room alongside Daniel Brooks and the hiring committee. He had deliberately remained invisible so no candidate would feel influenced by his presence. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. She sees people before she sees statistics. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off Naomi. That cannot be taught. By the end of the first day, unofficial conversations had already begun among several participants. Some admired Naomi's ideas. Others quietly questioned how someone with such ordinary clothes and an aging backpack had reached the final round. Naomi overheard every whispered assumption but responded to none of them. She simply organized her notes, thanked the coordinators, and prepared for the second day. As she walked toward the elevator that evening, she reached into her backpack to place her notebook beside Isaiah's drawing. The folded sketch slipped into her hand once more, and she smiled at the words written across the bottom. Every bridge begins with one side believing the other side is worth reaching. She slipped the drawing safely back inside, unaware that the greatest bridge of her own life had only just begun to take shape. The second day began before sunrise, and Naomi arrived at Whitmore Capital carrying the same quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult season of her life. She greeted the receptionist by name, thanked the security officer who held the door, and took her seat before anyone else entered the conference room. Outside, the first rays of morning light reflected against the glass towers of Manhattan. But inside the building, an entirely different kind of pressure was beginning to build. The final assessment would place every candidate into one team and present them with an unexpected challenge that had to be solved before the end of the afternoon. When the hiring committee entered, Daniel Brooks addressed the room with calm professionalism. Today's exercise is based on a real situation. You will receive limited information, limited time, and competing priorities. We are not looking for the smartest individual. We are looking for the person who helps everyone reach the best solution. A large digital screen illuminated with a detailed case study. One of Whitmore Capital's neighborhood revitalization projects had suddenly lost several key community partners only weeks before its scheduled launch. Local residents had become skeptical after a series of misunderstandings. Nonprofit organizations were withdrawing support, and small business owners feared another expensive promise that would never reach their streets. If the project collapsed, years of planning and millions of dollars in investment would produce almost nothing. The room immediately filled with rapid discussion. Several candidates focused on replacing the nonprofit organizations. Others argued for increasing financial incentives or delaying the launch entirely. Voices gradually became louder as everyone defended individual ideas instead of listening. Naomi remained quiet, carefully reading every page before speaking. Then she noticed something everyone else had overlooked. Buried inside a community feedback report was a sentence repeated by dozens of residents. They did not want another organization making decisions for them. They wanted someone willing to ask them what they actually needed. Naomi finally stood. Her voice was gentle, but every word carried confidence. We are trying to repair broken trust with larger budgets. Trust does not grow that way. Before changing the project, we should change the conversation. Invite the neighborhood leaders, the small business owners, the school principals, and the families into the same room. Listen first. Build the final plan together instead of delivering it to them afterward. One candidate immediately objected. That will slow everything down. Naomi answered without raising her voice. Moving faster in the wrong direction only gets you lost sooner. The conference room became silent. Even the evaluators paused their note-taking. Daniel slowly nodded while Ethan observed quietly from behind the glass wall once again. This time he was not watching her resume. He was watching her character under pressure. Naomi continued outlining practical steps, creating volunteer partnerships, transportation solutions, after-school family events, and small business mentorship programs that required cooperation instead of larger spending. She assigned responsibilities fairly among every teammate, even those who had disagreed with her only moments before. By the time the presentation concluded, what had begun as 7 competing individuals had become one coordinated team. After the candidates left the room, the hiring committee remained behind reviewing their evaluations. One executive looked surprised. She never tried to dominate the discussion. Daniel smiled. She did something much harder. She made everyone else better. Ethan looked down at Naomi's evaluation form before quietly placing his signature across the bottom. He had spent years searching for executives capable of leading billion-dollar investments. Today, he realized true leadership often appeared long before someone received an impressive title. At that same moment, several floors below, Naomi stepped outside the building and called Isaiah during his walk home from school. He answered with his usual cheerful energy. "How did it go?" Naomi looked up at the skyline glowing beneath the late afternoon sun and smiled. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring," she said softly, "but today I gave them everything I had." Neither of them realized that inside the executive conference room, the committee had already begun discussing one conclusion that would change far more than a hiring decision. They were no longer asking whether Naomi Carter deserved an opportunity. They were asking how they had almost allowed someone so extraordinary to slip away unnoticed. 3 weeks later, the maple trees lining Manhattan streets had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, and with them came a season of quiet change that few people inside Whitmore Capital had expected. Naomi Carter had officially joined the Community Development Division after earning the highest evaluation score in the assessment program. She arrived every morning carrying the same weathered backpack, greeting the custodians before sunrise, thanking receptionists by name, and treating interns with the same respect she offered senior executives. It did not take long for people throughout the building to notice that her greatest strength was not simply solving problems. It was helping others believe they could solve them together. Within weeks, community meetings that had once struggled to attract local participation were filled with neighborhood business owners, teachers, volunteers, and families who felt comfortable speaking because Naomi spent more time listening than presenting. She remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and followed through on every promise she made. Slowly, neighborhoods that had viewed Whitmore Capital with suspicion began welcoming the company's projects with cautious optimism. The numbers reflected the change. Attendance increased. Small businesses reported stronger weekend sales. Volunteer applications doubled. Yet whenever colleagues congratulated Naomi, she quietly redirected the praise toward the community itself. "People support what they help build," she often said with an easy smile. Ethan watched these changes with growing admiration. During executive meetings, project reports that once focused entirely on financial outcomes now included photographs of neighborhood cleanups, youth mentorship programs, family festivals, and new partnerships between local organizations. One afternoon, Daniel placed a report on Ethan's desk. "Community approval ratings have reached the highest level since we founded the division," he said. "Every major improvement began after Naomi joined the team." Ethan looked through pages filled with measurable success, but one photograph captured his attention more than any chart. It showed Naomi kneeling beside a young girl during a neighborhood design workshop, listening with complete attention as the child proudly explained a drawing of a future playground. There were no cameras positioned for publicity, no staged smiles, only genuine connection. Ethan quietly smiled. She has a remarkable way of making people feel important. Daniel nodded. That is because she believes they already are. Several days later, Whitmore Capital hosted its annual Community Partnership Gala inside a beautifully restored historic ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. Civic leaders, nonprofit directors, local entrepreneurs, educators, and business executives gathered beneath sparkling chandeliers to celebrate successful neighborhood initiatives. Naomi almost declined the invitation because she did not own formal evening clothes, but Emily surprised her by arranging a simple navy blue gown through the company's employee assistance program, insisting it was a celebration of achievement rather than appearance. As Naomi entered the ballroom, conversations briefly paused, not because of luxury or glamour, but because many guests immediately recognized the woman whose work had quietly transformed communities across the city. The same executives who had barely noticed her during her first assessment now crossed the room to shake her hand. Neighborhood leaders introduced her to their families with visible pride. Teachers thanked her for creating after-school opportunities. Small business owners spoke about storefronts that had remained open because someone had finally listened before offering advice. Naomi accepted every compliment with gentle humility, never forgetting the apartment where Isaiah still waited each evening with new bridge sketches spread across the kitchen table. Later that night, Ethan stepped onto the stage to deliver the closing remarks. The ballroom gradually became silent. He thanked community partners, volunteers, and employees before his eyes settled naturally on Naomi. Every successful organization eventually discovers that buildings, investments, and strategies matter, he said calmly. But none of them matter as much as people who choose to see value where others only see obstacles. This year reminded all of us that true leadership begins with respect, grows through service, and changes lives one conversation at a time. Applause filled the ballroom as Ethan invited Naomi to join him on the stage to receive the evening's community leadership recognition. She hesitated before walking forward, humbled by the unexpected honor. As she accepted the award, Ethan quietly smiled, remembering a rainy evening inside a small cafe when the entire future had balanced upon one simple question, spoken with extraordinary dignity. Neither of them needed to mention it. They both understood that the greatest transformations rarely begin with wealth, influence, or power. They begin the moment one human being truly sees another. 1 year later, the first cool breeze of October carried familiar memories through the streets of Manhattan. The city still moved with its relentless rhythm, yellow taxis still lined the avenues, and office towers still reflected the afternoon sun across polished sidewalks. Yet for Naomi Carter, everything had changed in ways that could never be measured by a paycheck or a job title. Isaiah's health had steadily improved with consistent medical care, and the young man who once filled notebooks with imaginary bridges had recently received an acceptance letter to one of New York's respected engineering programs. The drawing he had given Naomi months earlier now rested inside a simple frame on the wall of their new apartment, reminding them both that every bridge truly began with someone believing another person was worth reaching. That afternoon, Naomi left the Whitmore Capital offices a little earlier than usual after completing another successful community planning session. Instead of heading directly home, she found herself walking toward a quiet corner of Midtown almost without thinking. Some places called people back not because they were extraordinary, but because they marked the exact moment an ordinary life quietly changed direction. The small cafe looked almost identical to the way it had a year before. Warm lights glowed behind the windows, soft music drifted through the entrance, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread filled the crisp autumn air. Naomi smiled as she stepped inside. Before she could choose a table, she noticed someone already sitting near the same window where everything had begun. Ethan Whitmore looked up from his coffee and smiled with genuine warmth. "I had a feeling you might come today," he said. Naomi laughed softly. "I was about to say the same thing." Neither of them mentioned dates or anniversaries. They simply understood why they had both returned. Ethan glanced toward the server with an amused expression. "Would you mind bringing us 2 hamburgers?" The young server smiled and nodded before disappearing toward the kitchen. Naomi looked at Ethan with playful curiosity. "Are you certain you can finish yours this time?" Ethan laughed, the sound easy and relaxed in a way that would have surprised anyone who had known him only as the reserved billionaire from business magazines. "I learned an important lesson last year," he replied. "It is better to order enough for everyone than to wonder later whether you should have done more." They spent the next hour talking not about investments or awards, but about neighborhoods that now had thriving small businesses, children who finally had safe places to learn after school, volunteers who had become lifelong friends, and Isaiah's excitement about studying engineering. Ethan listened proudly as Naomi described future projects that would create opportunities for families who simply needed someone willing to believe in them before asking them to believe in themselves. When the meals arrived, both of them paused for a quiet moment before taking the first bite. No words were necessary. The simple meal represented far more than food. It had become a reminder that compassion offered with respect could travel farther than anyone imagined. As the evening sun painted the city in shades of amber and gold, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded a slightly worn restaurant receipt. Naomi recognized it immediately. At the bottom, beneath the faded ink of an ordinary dinner from 1 year earlier, 6 handwritten words remained clearly visible despite the passing months. "Some meetings are never accidents." Naomi smiled as she looked out the cafe window toward the crowded sidewalk where strangers continued passing one another, each carrying invisible hopes and unseen burdens. Somewhere among them might be another person waiting for a single act of kindness, another life standing only one conversation away from a different future. She quietly realized that the greatest gift Ethan had given her had never been a meal or a career. It had been the reminder that dignity grows when it is recognized, not rescued. Ethan reached for his coffee while Naomi gathered her coat, and together they stepped outside beneath the glowing lights of Manhattan. The city looked exactly as it always had, yet to them it would never be the same again, because they both understood a simple truth that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Wealth can open doors. Talent can build success. But a heart willing to see another human being with respect can change a destiny forever.